Saigon transformed into a literal furnace on April 29, 1975. Major Nguyễn Văn Ba gripped the vibrating controls of a massive CH-47 Chinook. But his only hope for rescue lay on a flight deck far too small for landing. As the North Vietnamese Army tightened its iron grip around the capital, artillery fire signaled the final collapse of the Republic. For this veteran pilot, the war was officially over, but the struggle for survival had just reached its most feverish pitch. The air over South Vietnam was thick, with the black smoke of burning fuel and the rhythmic, desperate thrum of retreating aircraft. Operation Frequent Wind had officially begun, marking the final chaotic chapter of the American presence in Southeast Asia. While the high-profile evacuation focused on Tan Son Nhut and the U.S. Embassy, Major Ba was acting on raw instinct and a father's love. He managed to gather his wife and children alongside roughly 25 other refugees, ushering them into the cavernous, humming belly of his Boeing CH-47 Chinook. The tandem rotor aircraft was a masterpiece of mid-century engineering, a 50,000-pound behemoth designed to carry heavy artillery, not to navigate a frantic escape into the unknown. As he pulled the collective and felt the aircraft claw its way into the humid sky, Ba left behind everything he had ever known. Below him, the landscape of his home was disappearing under the shadow of the He steered the giant helicopter toward the gray horizon of the South China Sea, searching for any sign of the American fleet. He had no official orders and no radio contact with the ships at sea. He was a pilot flying on a prayer, looking for a sliver of steel in the vastness of the Bien Dong. The weight of his family and the 30 souls on board pressed heavily on his mind as the coastline of Vung Tau faded into the mist. He was headed toward a rendezvous with a ship called the USS Kirk, a Knox-class destroyer escort that was never meant to hold a giant like the Chinook. Commander Paul Jacobs stood on the bridge of the USS Kirk, staring at a horizon choked with the black smoke of a dying country and the frantic buzz of distant rotors. It was the late afternoon of April 29th, 1975, and the Republic of Vietnam was in its final agonizing hours. The Kirk was a Knox-class destroyer escort, a slender 438-foot vessel designed for anti-submarine warfare, not for the mass evacuation of a civilian population. Its flight deck was a mere 40-foot square of non-skid plating, built specifically to catch the nimble SH-2 Sea Sprite. But as the tropical sun began its descent over the South Sea, a shadow fell over the ship's fantail that defied every tactical manual and safety regulation in the United States Navy. Emerging from the haze was the unmistakable twin-rotor silhouette of a Boeing CH-47 Chinook. This was the heaviest lift workhorse in the VNAF inventory, a massive aircraft capable of carrying a maximum takeoff weight of 50,000 pounds. To the young sailors on the Kirk, it looked like a gray metal cathedral hovering in the sky. Major Nguyễn Văn Ba, the veteran pilot at the controls, was flying on nothing but instinct and the sheer will to keep his family alive. He had roughly 30 passengers on board, his wife, his children, and a terrified group of refugees they were out of fuel, out of land, and out of time. Commander Jacobs now faced a technical and moral dilemma of staggering proportions. The Chinook's rotors spanned 60 feet from tip to tip. Any attempt to land on the Kirk's cramped deck would result in the blades striking the ship's superstructure, turning the fantail into a lethally spinning furnace of shrapnel and JP-4 jet fuel. However, turning them away was a death sentence. Jacobs looked at the behemoth hovering just yards away and made a command. He commanded his crew to clear the deck. Under the direction of Chief Engineer Hugh Doyle, sailors scrambled to push existing O-1 Bird Dogs and smaller UH-1 Hueys, aircraft that had arrived only hours earlier, directly into the ocean. Thousands of pounds of military machinery were sacrificed to the waves to create a vacuum of space for the impossible. Yet, as the deck cleared, the grim reality remained. The Chinook was still far too large to ever save, but the deck of the USS Kirk was never meant to host a giant of the skies. As Major Nguyễn Văn Ba brought the massive CH-47 Chinook into a low, precarious hover just 15 feet above the ship's small fantail, the atmosphere transformed into a violent vortex of salt spray. On the deck below, men like anti-submarine warfare technician Donald Cox stood their ground against the hurricane-force downwash of the tandem rotors, bracing themselves for what the crew would later immortalize as the human waterfall. There was no time for formal procedures or safety lines. The fuel was critical, and the North Vietnamese were closing the door on Saigon for good. Commander Paul Jacobs watched from the bridge, his heart in his throat, as the helicopter's side door slid back to reveal a cabin. The first to appear at the edge were the children. Without hesitation, the sailors below raised their arms, and the first infant was dropped into the void. It was a scene of visceral, raw desperation as the passengers leaped through the hovering gap, falling into the waiting arms of young American sailors who caught them like precious cargo. Donald Cox focused entirely on the descent, feeling the sudden jarring weight of small bodies hitting his chest before he passed them to the safety of the hangar. Major Ba, meanwhile, was performing a feat of airmanship that defied both gravity and physical exhaustion, fighting the erratic sea winds to keep the massive airframe from drifting into the Kirk's superstructure. His own wife and children were among those tumbling onto the deck, their lives hanging literally in the balance of his steady hand on the controls. The noise was a primitive roar, cutting through the salt air as the weight of the aircraft shifted with every person who jumped. Approximately 30 souls plunged into the arms of the crew, a miracle, but the most shock. By the time the last passenger was pulled onto the deck, the small destroyer escort was crowded with weeping families, and the air was thick with the scent of JP-4 fuel and survival. Major Ba signaled to the men below, a final acknowledgement of the lives saved. But his own struggle was only half finished. He was still strapped into a 50,000-pound machine with no place to land, and the most dangerous maneuver. The air over the South China Sea on that humid April afternoon was thick with the scent of salt spray and JP-4 aviation fuel. But for Major Nguyễn Văn Ba, the most overwhelming sensation was the sudden hollow silence. For the first time on this long below him, on the cramped flight deck of the USS Kirk, 30 souls, including his own wife and children, were finally safe, caught by the outstretched arms of American sailors like Donald Cox. But Ba's mission had one final, harrowing stage. The massive Boeing CH-47, a machine that had been his lifeline through years of service in the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, was now a 50,000-pound liability. It was too massive to land on the Knox-class destroyer escort and too dangerous to leave hovering near the men on deck whose lives he had just entrusted to the Americans. With a steady hand, Major Ba pulled the cyclic, pivoting the great tandem rotor beast away from the Kirk and out over the open water, hovering just 60 yards off the ship's starboard beam. But what followed remains one of the most incredible feats of airmanship ever captured on 16mm film by the mesmerized crew of the Kirk. As the helicopter hung suspended 10 feet above the churning whitecaps, Ba performed a task that defied every law of flight safety. He reached down and began to strip. He kicked off his heavy flight boots and struggled out of his flight suit, all while managing the delicate, vibrating controls of a tandem rotor. To fly a Chinook requires a constant, nuanced dialogue between the pilot's hands and feet. To undress while doing so is a feat of impossible coordination. He knew that the weight of his Nomex gear and boots would act as an anchor the moment he hit the sea, pulling him down into the dark depths before he could ever resurface. Clad only in his undergarments, Ba regained full control for the Chinook's final seconds of flight. He began a slow, deliberate roll to the right, tilting the massive rotors toward the waves to ensure the aircraft would fall away from his exit path. At the precise moment of no return, as the leading edges of the blades began to shatter against the water in a violent spray of metal and foam, he leapt from the left-hand door into the void. The aircraft struck the sea with a bone-shaking roar, rolling onto its side as the rotors disintegrated into a cloud of jagged shards. For several agonizing seconds, the crew of the Kirk saw only debris and oil. Then, a lone figure surfaced amidst the wreckage. Commander Paul Jacobs immediately ordered a whaleboat into the water. As the American sailors pulled the exhausted, gasping pilot from the oil-slicked waves, they realized they were not just rescuing a refugee. They were witnessing the final defiant act of a man who had sacrificed his machine, his career, and nearly his life to bring his family to the threshold of freedom. As the white foam and oil from the sunken Chinook dissipated into the vastness of the South China Sea, a new, uncertain chapter began for Major Nguyễn Văn Ba and the 30 souls he had carried through the sky. The USS Kirk was no longer merely a Knox-class destroyer escort. It had become a floating sanctuary anchored in a sea of transition. But the ship's mission was only expanding. In a final, clandestine act of the Vietnam War, Commander Paul Jacobs and leading the remnants of the South Vietnamese Navy, a flotilla of nearly 30 ships overflowing with 30,000 desperate refugees, across the waves to Subic Bay in the Philippines. For the men on the Kirk, like Donald Cox and Hugh Doyle, the image of the falling helicopter became an indelible mark on their consciousness, a silent testament to the Major Ba and his family eventually moved forward into the first wave of Vietnamese resettlement, finding their way to the United States to build a life far from the terrors of re-education camps or the collapse of the Republic. For 35 years, this story remained a cherished but quiet memory, preserved in the grain of 16mm film and the private recollections of those who were there. It was only through the 2010 documentary The Lucky Few and subsequent coverage by NPR and the Smithsonian that the American public finally recognized the Kirk's specific brand of heroism. The crew was eventually honored for their role in one of the most significant humanitarian rescues in naval history. Today, the mental image of that Chinook rolling into the deep remains a sacred symbol for the Vietnamese American community. It stands as a monument to the skill, the desperation, and the unyielding survival instinct of a people who, on April 29, 1975, left everything behind for the chance to breathe free. History has more secrets to reveal. Subscribe and share this with someone who loves history.